To design EER diagram, there are two constraints that you need to put into consideration. Those two constraints are completeness constraint and disjointness constraint. Completeness constraint indicating the single line and double line, disjointness constraint indicating the disjoint or overlapping, in other words, the small letter D or O that we put into the circle. Starting with the completeness constraint. For completeness constraint, it has two choices. One is single line, the other one is a double line. Single line indicating it's a partial constraint, double line indicating that it's a total constraint. The concept is exactly the same with the relationship that we discussed in the ER diagram. So if we put a total constraint, which we use double line in the EER diagram, well, that specifies that every entity in the superclass must be a member of some subclasses based on this specialization or generalization. So for example, employee. Every employee must be either salaried employee or hourly paid employee. So that is what we're going to put a double line over there. They have to participate in these choices. Partial, if you put a single line, indicating that an entity need not to belong to any of the subclasses. So that is the idea of the single line and double line. If you still recall in our last video, if the superclass and subclass is coming from the generalization process, which means it's a bottom-up approach. The example that we discussed is car and truck, and then we generalized a vehicle entity to form a superclass. If that is the way we're doing it, usually this is a total participation, which we will put a double line over this superclass and subclass, because the superclass is derived from the subclasses and hence contains only the entities that are in the subclass. Let's take a look at some examples. This is a slide that we use several times, so it's easier for you to understand. Manager is a subclass of the employee. You can see that this is a single line indicating that not every employee is a manager. If that is a manager, then you will need to have a local relationship that manages the project. You can see that this is a special indication. You have only one subclass based on this characterization. On the other side, the example I used earlier, salary employee and hourly employee, every employee have to participate in this subclass, because all the employees are either salary employee or hourly employee. On the other end, you can see that this is a single line over there indicating that employee may participate in the secretary role, technician role, engineer role, or not. So that we have a single line over here. That means the job title may have some other choices not included in here. And therefore, you can have a single line to specify that information. On the other hand, remember this is the slide that we discussed in the generalization. We have car entity and we have a truck entity because there are three attributes that are in common, and therefore we created a vehicle to form a superclass. Based on this type of the operation, you can see that usually we have a double line over here because all of those vehicles are coming from either the car or the truck, and that's why we have a double line over here. So that is the idea regarding to the completeness constraint. What's the meaning of the single line and double line? The second constraint regarding to the EER is about the disjointness. And that is what we see about the small d in the earlier company database. Let's talk about this. If we put a d indicating that that is a disjointness constraint, specify that the subclass of the specialization must be disjoint. So what is the meaning of the disjoint? Disjoint indicating an entity can be a member of at most one of the subclass of the specialization. So you can see that if you put a D over there, if you're going to participate in here, you have to choose one. Since I use the word if you participate in this operation, that is actually specified by the single line and double line. Therefore, if you put a double line and a D, that means you have to choose one participation of the subclass. If you put a single line and a D, that means you can choose one or you don't choose at all. So that is the combination of the completeness as well as the disjointness constraints. And therefore, you can see that if, when we put a D over here, employee, you notice there is a single line indicating that you may or may not participate in this operation. If we put a D over there, indicating that you can choose either secretary or technician or engineer. You cannot be a secretary and at the same time be a technician because you put a D over here. If you put a double line over here indicating that employee have to choose one of the job role, that means there are only 3 job roles in the employee operation. So those are the combination of the constraints to have different meanings. If it is not disjoint, means that you have multiple choices that specify it as a overlapping. That is, the same entity may be a member of more than one subclass of the specialization. And in that case, we will put an O in the small circle. And therefore, you can see that this is the part used in the factory. We have a O in that we put over here to specify that this is a double line and an O operation. What I'm trying to say is that for the parts that we are going to use, they can be manufactured parts or purchased parts. So if you have one part that can come in from manufactured, that part can also come in from purchased, or that can be some manufactured parts that you can manufacture by your own, but at the same time it's not enough, so you still need to purchase from it. And that's what that O try to indicate. So indicating that for the entities in the superclass, they can participate more than one subclass. And therefore, if we try to combine those 2 constraints together, there are 4 choices because each constraint has only 2 choices. If we focus on the total constraints, you can see that you have to. So because we put a double line over there, if you put a double line and disjoint, this might be the most strict constraints that you can create, that indicating you have to choose exactly one subclass. So only one. And you have to choose that. If that is total, that means you have to, but you put an overlap over there, that indicating you have to choose one or several subclasses. On the other side, if they are partial, that means you have the choice not to choose. So indicating if that is a partial and a disjoint, that means you can choose 0 or 1 subclass. If the choices are partial and overlapping, that indicating you may choose one or no or several subclasses. So I hope this slide can summarize what we have discussed about the constraints that we have seen. There are some general rules. If you try to delete an entity from superclass, implies that it is automatically deleted from all of the subclass to which it belongs. So if you have an employee that is a engineer who is a manager and he is salary-based employee, obviously if you try to fire this employee from the superclass and we don't have this superclass anymore, then all of its subclasses does not matter anymore. Inserting an entity in a superclass of a total specialization, which means it's a double line, that means they have to participate in some subclasses. So in this case, if you try to insert a new entity into this kind of entity, it is mandatory insert into at least one of the subclass of the specialization because it's a total participation. Finally, we look into one last concept regarding to the superclass and subclass. A subclass may itself have further subclasses specified on it. So a subclass can have more subclasses. And therefore, we looked into a tree structure or a lattice structure. So hierarchy. Hierarchy is a constraint that every subclass has only one superclass. If you took, and if you still remember the data structure class, this is the tree structure. So there's only one path from the root node to every single other leaf nodes. So in this case, this is what we call a single inheritance. This is basically a tree structure, and that is what we call a hierarchy. On the other end, if you have some shared subclass, that means you have one subclass that has two superclasses. That means they are what we call a lattice, and this is called the multiple inheritance. If you look into this slide, you will be able to understand. Previously, we have employee, and based on job type, we have these three subclasses. We have manager. We have how based on how they paid. We create two subclasses over here. Take a look of this one, engineer manager. This is a subclass belonging to engineer superclass, belonging to manager superclass, as well as belonging to salaried employee. And therefore, this is what we call a shared subclass, because we have one shared subclass. As long as you have one, then the whole thing is not a tree structure, so it is not a hierarchy. This is a lattice. If I'm asking what are the attributes describing the engineer manager, it will be all the attributes coming from the employee plus all the attributes, local attributes of the engineer, plus local attributes of the manager, plus local attributes of the salary employee, plus the local attributes of engineer manager. And this is a good example to show you that what is a hierarchy versus what is a lattice. So a leaf node is a class that has no subclasses of its own, which is exactly the same concept we discussed in the tree structure. A subclass with more than one superclass is called a shared subclass, and that will cause multiple inheritance. Notice that the existence of at least one shared subclass leads to a lattice. Otherwise, it's a hierarchy. So you can see that in this picture, it talks about a person. Use a double line and an O indicating a person have to choose one or more subclasses here. So it can be an employee, and at the same time, they are also an alumni. Because of that, we have to have an O, because an employee can be alumni basically. And students can come back as an alumni as well. So this is an important understanding of that. And we put a double line over here is because if that's the person we want to keep track of, they better to be related to the school. And the persons, there are only three different type of persons that we are interested in, employee, alumni, and student. Employee have to choose exactly one over here only. It can be a staff or a faculty or a student assistant, and that cannot be overlapped to each other. So you have a disjoint, which means a staff is a staff. It cannot be a faculty. A faculty is a faculty. It cannot be a student assistant over here. On the other side, student can be further divided into graduate student as well as undergraduate student. You see, this one use the most strict one, double line, and a D indicating you have to choose one of that. Student assistant is a shared subclass. So think about what are the attributes describing the student assistant. Student, you need to understand this part, okay? So based on one characteristic, graduate student or undergraduate student, we have this superclass and subclass design. On the other side, not every student is a student assistant. That's why this is a separation, another characteristic of this superclass and subclass. If you are a student assistant, you have to choose either research assistant or teaching assistant. You can see that based on this design, a research assistant cannot do teaching jobs because it is a disjoint over here. If assistant research assistant can also do the teaching, then this D has to be a O overlapping over here. And therefore, try to understand what's the big pictures describing here. And therefore, I'm going to give you some assignments. First of all, in the EER diagram that we just see, this is a lattice or a hierarchy. Pretty simple, right? What are the attributes describing the graduate student? Also, what are the attributes describing the teaching assistant? Try to provide these answers as detailed as possible to me through the Blackboard, and I am looking forward to see your answers.